Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jeff Kripal. I'm from Rice University, the Department of Religion, and we're here with our first webinar on opening the archives of the impossible with Professor John Phillip Santos, who will be with us in a second here. I'm going to give a very short, very formal introduction, just so you know who John is and what he does, and then we'll just jump right in and have a conversation. And if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat function, in the Q&A function, and we'll hope to have a freewheeling conversation that'll set the spirit or the tone for our big event in March. Okay, so this is taken directly from the Texas Archival Resources Online. Originally from San Antonio, Texas, John Phillip Santos is a producer, journalist, and author whose work examines intersecting concerns of media, culture, and identity. For 6 years, he was a program officer in the Media Arts and Culture Unit of the Ford Foundation, where he managed a $40 million portfolio of grants supporting new media productions in radio, television, and film, and the development of public interest channels and networks around the world. Prior to joining the Ford Foundation, John was an executive producer and director of new program development for 13 WNET in New York City, and was also producer of over 40 broadcast documentaries on culture, religion, politics, and spirituality for CBS News. These programs were produced in 16 countries and deal with such subjects as liberation theology, Islamic fundamentalism, the AIDS epidemic, new religious movements, and eco-theology. Numerous programs for CBS and PBS were nominated for documentary Emmys. Santos was elected as a Rhodes Scholar in 1979 and holds degrees in English literature and language from Oxford University and philosophy and literature from the University of Notre Dame. He has worked extensively as a journalist, doing arts and culture reviews and features for the San Antonio Express News, along with opinion pieces for a wide variety of newspapers and publications such as the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Santos's family memoir, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, published by Viking Penguin in 1999, was nominated for the National Book Award. In the fall of 2002, Santos was a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, where he began work on his next book, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire. 2 manuscripts of poems, and on the development of Teletopia Labs, a workshop for documentary performances exploring the interface between cultural identity and digital media. He lived in New York City for 20 years, returning to San Antonio in May of 2005. John now teaches courses like Ancestral Journeys to Now, an ongoing seminar exploring narratives of the origins, history, evolution, and hermeneutics of mestizo identities and their myriad origins in the indigenous and Indo-European worlds, engaged with the context of contemporary issues in globalization and migration. He is presently the University Distinguished Senior Lecturer in Mestizo Cultural Studies, Honors College, University of Texas, San Antonio. John, welcome.
Que gusto, hermano maestro Jeff. What a delight and honor to be with you. Greet you with much love and respect, everyone watching. Much love and much respect. So eager to chat.
Yeah, likewise. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. So maybe let's start with you and let's talk a bit about your life. I mean, I just read a kind of resume version of it, but I know there's a lot of riches there. And then let's eventually, of course, move into the archives of the impossible and why you are so interested in those and what you might be looking forward to for the event in March.
Sure, Jeff. Well, I was born and raised here in San Antonio, Texas, where I am today. I live actually in the ancestral home that I grew up in. So even as far out into the world as I ventured, I swam like a salmon upstream to spawn. We have an 11-year-old daughter, and and returned to San Antonio, as you said, in the early 2000s. Growing up here in a very tightly knit Chicano family, the Santos and Garcia families, my father's families particularly, was a way of connecting to Mexico. We had living connections to Coahuila, so we were often traveling between here and there. And, we were ostensibly Catholics, but we were, Mexican Catholics, which is a refinement on the tradition in very distinctive ways. And my grandmother and her two sisters were Rosicrucians, and they were connected to esoteric philosophy in what turned out to be very powerful ways that wasn't really communicated to me until I was a teenager, really. One of my great aunts, my tia Pepa, was a follower of the healer Niño Fidencio, and she was an herbal healer as well. And they introduced us to a way of seeing the world that did not in any way problematize the extraordinary or the anomalous or the magical. They were, in fact, I guess, ambassadors of all of that to us, and imparted to us a sense of what it meant to come out of the past that we did out of Mexico, and what it meant that we were in these lands that were once Mexico, and that we were part of this borderless community of peoples that span the Rio Grande. So, they gave me a connection to thinking about spirituality, about magic, about the extraordinary, that I later would return to as a journalist, and began writing about some of the experiences of belief communities around the world. And I think about that word belief as being a really important part of it, belief and story. And one of the things that connects me to the project of Archives of the Impossible.
So, I feel like, well, I know I've learned a lot from you just talking to you. We haven't known each other for long, really, since just last summer. And one of the really strong things I've sort of absorbed from you is this notion of the mestizo, or the mix, which I've encountered elsewhere through with my graduate students and Gloria Anzaldúa.
Yeah.
But from you in a very specific way, and our conversations around Carlos Castaneda and a kind of different kind of cosmology that someone like that might be coming out of, and just the whole notion of mestizo or mestizo consciousness has really moved me, actually. And your notion of a Republica Cosmica, right? And if I can, I'd love to quote from you. I watched some of your videos before we did this, and there's this set of beautiful lines that I'd like to read and maybe have you just jazz off of a bit.
Sure.
At one point, you're talking about a Republica Cosmica, and you say, in fact, we are from everywhere, then we have a right to be anywhere, then no borders will stand. And I thought those were gorgeous lines. I thought they were provocative lines, and I was hoping we could sort of begin there.
Yeah, I think about that line of thought as being a kind of an emergent human ethic, a kind of a new human ethic, and it's ironically something that has emerged out of the testimony of genetic science. So genetic science has basically demonstrated to us how deeply mixed we all are, one to the other, across continents, across time. Stunningly, the human DNA turns out to be not only exhaustively a chronicle of our ancestors, but it's time coded, and it reveals us all to be mestizos, what was always thought to be those who were apart. There were the people of pure lineage, and the mestizos were in the construction of the Mexican casta system, Spanish race science. Mestizaje was the introduction of impurity into the bloodline of the regal Spanish tradition. So there's a traditional construction in terms of what happened in Mexico with the conquest of the evangelization, perhaps some resistance, and then syncretism, some kind of blending of Spanish and indigenous sources of identity. But in fact, writing like that of Castaneda or Gloria Anzaldúa and many others demonstrates that, and throughout indigenous communities in Mexico indeed, and South Texas, demonstrates that there's something else also taking place, which is a way of being, a way of becoming that was never vanquished, that is unconquerable, in fact, and continues to unfold in throughout Mexico, throughout the borderlands of South Texas. And that's really been, the focus of my interest in, how to share the sense of connection to mestizaje, to the global migrations of our ancestors. República Cósmica, the idea of a cosmic republic, was really owes a lot of its construction to the great Mexican philosopher, Jose Vasconcelos, and his pivotal essay, Raza Cósmica, from 1926. A borderlands person. He was born and raised in Piedras Negras, went to school in Eagle Pass, and he writes this seminal essay which, turned the idea of the mestizo on its head. It had been seen as derogatory. Vasconcelos celebrates it, and he celebrates it as this mingling of all races. I mean, he's fraught with contradictions. He was, in some respects, he believed in a kind of Christian European supremacy, but he also was articulating a very different way of seeing the way that mestizaje in Mexico combined these deep indigenous sources with all of the traditions that had come from Europe. And Vasconcelos, like Francisco Madero, like my grandmother and her sisters, were very involved in continental esoteric thought. Vasconcelos traveled to Paris and learned about theosophy along with Madero. So there were these currents in North Mexico, sort of beyond the reach of the Inquisition and what becomes the Texas borderlands, where there was a kind of a creative energy around the way that mestizo identities, mestiza identities have emerged over time. And Anzaldúa and Castaneda both demonstrate that within that story, within that kind of emerging way of seeing ourselves, there is this unconquerable core, this unconquerable nucleus that does connect us to the indigenous sources of our identity and to the many sources of identity coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition as well.
Can you say more, John, about how such a vision connects up with the archives and with these anomalous phenomena?
Yeah.
I mean, I have a sense of where you might go with that, but I'd love to hear you talk about where, and your interest. I mean, I just had this conversation with Whitley Strieber yesterday, and I beamed him into a class.
Yeah.
He was talking about a cosmic humanity that reminds me a lot of what you're talking about right now.
Well, there might be something in the water because Whitley is also a San Antonio lad, but growing up here, I can say in addition to this mestizo consciousness that was imparted to us by our ancestors, it was growing up in the 60s here. We had one of the very first paranormal radio shows, a guy named Alan Dale on WOAI here. Alan Dale reported on UFO sightings, and he reported on cattle mutilations. I remember from when I was a kid listening to this radio show, a conversation between Alan Dale and the sheriff out in West Texas. This prototypical animal mutilation with tongue removed, eyes removed, anus removed, and this caller said, I don't know why everybody's so confused. It's an election year and the Republicans are looking for any old asshole to run for governor. So there was something in our popular culture here that was open and curious about all of this. Within my family, certainly we're all interested. And then Jeff, I don't know if I've ever told you that, we had an uncle, my uncle Charles Shrimplin, who was an Anglo photographer, married my Aunt Connie. He was a photographer for NASA, and he ran the photo lab in NASA. So after every space mission, he would send us these packets of space photographs. And I mean, for a good part of my youth, that was my career path, was, off-world, to head into space. It was only when I realized that you had to go through the military to become an astronaut that I began to reconsider. But that was a big part of it, growing up in San Antonio, and what we shared in this landscape. This it's a place that was full of springs, and when I was growing up, we still had very easy access to the woods. All the mystery of nature that we could find, within a couple of blocks of walking from this house. It's not so much anymore, but at that time it was. So, what connects me to the project of the archives in many ways was that, I was collecting stories as well. I was creating a kind of impromptu archive. That's what I'll talk about in March. Sort of the secret chronicle of the impossible that runs through these lands, through these borderlands. When I went in, I was in Houston a few weeks back to visit the archive. So I spent a day there, just a day, and I barely scratched the surface, of course, but I spent a lot of time with the letters that people wrote to Whitley in the after the publication of Communion. And I don't know, there are many thousands, I think. I think there are 7 boxes, and I got maybe quickly through 3/4 of one. And in that sort of quick run through those letters, I thought, well, these are all super interesting accounts of people's own experiences of the anomalous, and eerily similar one to the other. But I thought, well, maybe I can read through these quickly, looking for something specific. And I thought, well, can I find something either relating to the borderlands or to Latinx correspondence? So I began, because there are a lot of Andersons who wrote to Whitley. There are a lot of Bennetts, a lot of Barkers, but not so many Santoses or Cantus or Treviños or Garcias. Although I did find some really interesting cases there. One in particular that stood out for me was written by a Cuban American man, and he was remembering an episode in Cuba, and this is one of these events that sort of bridges the world of the anomalous and the life after death narratives, in which he was in this area near a bay, and he was approached by a fisherman who came and brought his boat to this little dock and invited this boy to go with him to show him a waterfall or something. I think it was a cascade near the beach. And so he goes and he has this adventure. He comes back, he tells his mother, and he describes the person who had picked him up in this boat to his mother, and she believed that it was her dead father, who had never met this young boy. So there are ways of plumbing that archive. That was just, as I say, scratching the surface. I spent a lot of time. I was inspired by Borges's work, and Borges was always fascinated with libraries, with infinite libraries, the Library of Babel, great story of Borges's. And I spent a lot of time in the Archivo de los Indianos in northern Spain, an archive of the people, including my mother's family, who set out from Asturias to come to the New World, to Mexico, but also the Archivo de las Indias in Sevilla. And this is the archive that Columbus establishes. Columbus establishes this archive upon his return to Spain. And so it is a vast compendium of all of the records and chronicles of Las Indias, of the Indies, of Mexico, and the Spanish world of Latin America. And with archives, you can never fully know what you're going to uncover there. You never, it's part of the experience of going into such a place that you delve in and things present themselves to you. Things kind of emerge out of the archive to speak to you.
Mhm.
And that sort of happened in a very telescoped way in those few hours I was able to spend at the library in Rice. I expect much more of that in future visits.
No, there's this, let's call it psychometric. There's this, psychometry would be this claim that a medium could handle a scarf of a person and then know where that person is or where the body is. I mean, or relics, take relics, kind of pieces of body parts essentially of great saints that were revered and still are revered. There's something like that about an archive. You're not reading documents online, or you're not looking them as copies in books. You're physically handling the actual letters from these people. There's something's transmitted in a kind of almost physical way that I think is really unique.
Well, I don't think we talked about it because we haven't really chatted about my time there in the archive, but I was struck in the communion letters how there was almost a kind of decultured aspect to these stories. They didn't have ethno-racial, cultural references in many cases. It's much more almost technological. The narratives have a kind of technological quality, or aspects of the experience suggest something machinic at play, which I found really interesting. Has never really kind of been evident to me before. And then I had a brief visit with some of is it Edwin May?
Mhm.
So Edwin May's remote viewing collection, and here, it was very helpful, for one thing, to kind of get a look at some documents that lay out the underlying protocol of remote viewing, and what it reveals is that practice is very much about what we talked about in our last visit, Jeff, the quantum world. The idea of an entangled universe that can be accessed through a kind of specific practice of psychic bilocation, or maybe astral projection. Maybe those are for technical remote viewers are not terms they would use interchangeably. But there we have, on the one hand, I'm looking at the borderlands as a specific place where extraordinary things have happened, unimaginable encounters in incredible places. And in the case of the remote viewing, it's almost as if it's non-local. It's about non-locality, about something that connects everything through the lens of consciousness. And so it's fascinating that these two domains of experience can coexist in the archive, two very different ways of understanding something about the mystery of us.
Yeah, the phrase I like to use is collection is connection.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, the archives, we have a major collection on remote viewing, which was the US military and intelligence, essentially psychic espionage program, run out of mostly Palo Alto under Ed May. But we also have a large collection on mediumship, physical mediumship, from an English medium named Stuart Alexander. And then, of course, these letters from Ann and Whitley Strieber, which detail mostly contact and UFO experiences. So, the working hypothesis of the archives is that it's all connected. The UFO is actually connected to the NDE, and the dead and the alien actually are of the same quality here. So, but that's a hypothesis. We don't know that because people haven't really done enough work on it. I just want to back up a bit because for our listeners, so there you referenced already two of the major collections, the Anne and Whitley Strieber collection, which is about 7,000 letters that were sent to Whitley after Communion appeared in 1987. He actually received about 250,000 letters.
Wow.
But Anne culled them down to these 7,000 and then had about 800 of those typed up. And those were the letters that Whitley gifted us a few years ago. So I've spent the most time in that collection. And I just want to say that the thing that strikes me most about those letters is what those letter writers most wanted was to be seen and heard by Whitley.
Yeah.
They didn't care about fame or money they just wanted another human being to tell them that what they experienced was not crazy, basically.
Yeah.
And I was so struck by that. The letters would always end with something like, please call me, here's my phone number.
Yeah.
Or please write me, here's my address. And they're touching. I mean, they're not from all walks of life and from all socioeconomic classes, as you pointed out, but they're from a broad spectrum of people.
Well, I was thinking about that in terms of how we think about extending the circle of inclusion in terms of the kinds of materials that could come into an archive like this from other parts of the world, other language zones. And, I don't know of a continent where there aren't traditions of interest in the esoteric and in the paranormal. Interestingly, with the letters, Jeff, also you see what a great relationship Anne had and Whitley, the way they worked together, because Anne has these notes on the letters that are kind of the beginning of an index system.
Right.
So she'll say there'll be something, a ghost reference, or disc shaped craft, or so she began to develop a kind of a coding system to reference the connections between these letters. Super fascinating. And you're right, they're not fan letters.
No.
They're what we call testimonios, And what strikes me as very resonant in terms of thinking about the connections to the esoteric in Mestizo culture, people always talk about, Garcia Marquez and magic realism. Well, real magic is what connects much of the Spanish-speaking world, a sense of connection to living real magic. So I've always kind of been somewhat skeptical of using this term magic realism. It's more like realistic magic.
Yeah, I mean, magical realism is a way to roll your eyes and create a little distance, right? Let's turn it into a cool literary genre, but let's not take it
romantic,
seriously.
it's fanciful, it's flowery and literary, but not real. And what's interesting in terms of some of the material I'll talk about in March, Jeff, in terms of chronicles, codex literature, the Florentine Codex, early chronicles of Spanish settlers in what becomes South Texas, the extraordinary things they report seeing. And in the case of ancient Mesoamerican chronicles, they lived in history in contact with gods. When the people who will become the Aztecs, the Nahuas, set out in search of their new homeland, they carry their god with them. He's in a little magic bundle on their backs. And when Moctezuma I, the first Moctezuma, sends out a delegation of shamans to find their original homeland, they become birds. They arrive at this hill where the mother goddess Coatlicue receives them. These happened in historical time. These stories took place in historical time. The presagios, the augurs that Moctezuma II, the emperor who would meet Cortés, in the years before the arrival of the Spaniards, he reports a series of these augurs, and they're called presagios. And they're often discounted. Oh, well, the Spaniards, messed with these chronicles to kind of justify the conquest. And
Right.
but the example we have is that these people lived in a time in which history was magic, and our interaction with these supernatural forces was something that happened in historical time.
Maybe, John, something we've talked a bit about, and maybe we can bring this to a particular case. And I think you'll make your same point there, but with an example is Maria Agreda.
Yeah.
Who talk about magical, but also very Spanish, but also involves Texas and frankly San Antonio. So maybe if you could say is that a good example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, it gives us a sense of what was going on in Spain. At the time of this encounter.
Yeah.
A cloistered nun in Agreda, Spain, who has been reading the chronicles, the early chronicles of Cabeza de Vaca and the letters of Cortés, and she's aware of this project of evangelization, and evangelization was critical to the completion of time. The Spaniards believed that they had to complete the project of evangelization before Christ's return, and so it was prerequisite to evangelize the savages. And Maria de Agreda, in her cloistered space, projects her spirit in a series of many hundred experiences to the landscapes of what is now West Texas, sort of the El Paso area, the Chicano Indians of West Texas, and would appear to the people as an apparition of a woman in blue. And there are stories of a woman in blue here in San Antonio in the indigenous community, in the Coahuilteca community. So her geolocation might have been off by a couple hundred miles. She might have made a couple of stops in Bexar County, but she illustrates, what was going on in Spain. There's another incredible case of this Lucrecia Marquez, a dreamer, a prophetic dreamer who gets examined by the Inquisition. The sense of these two people, the Spaniards and the indigenous, who were still living in a magical world. And it's connected directly to the founding of San Antonio in so much as one of the Franciscan missionaries who creates Mission San Jose here in San Antonio was a follower of Maria de Agreda, and he believed that he was completing her mission to create this settlement for Indians here. So, it's important in terms of thinking about these chronicles to understand that, and it's only 500 years ago for the conquest, 300 years ago for the founding of San Antonio, that we're not so far from a time when history was inhabited by magical phenomena that people openly referred to in their chronicles and their writings. It's something that William Blake lamented greatly in terms of the passing of a world, the passing of a way of seeing the world that Blake was aware of in his own cultural context.
That's a really nice segue into some questions we received, right? And I really want to keep this to, we're going to stop at exactly 5.
Great.
We're going to honor people's time.
Yeah.
We've got 25 minutes, but we did receive some questions beforehand, and they're actually, in my opinion, quite good. And one of them is about what you just said. Because what the secular historian is going to say is, oh, those people were just superstitious. We now know better, and the world didn't change. We just got smarter, essentially. There's no such thing as magic. There's no such thing as bilocating nuns. That's in people's pious heads. So here's the question. I don't think these people would mind me using their names either. The first one is from Sebastiano de Filippi. And his question is, what would be your thoughts about the link between traditional religions and the paranormal phenomena in modernity. In
Yeah,
other words, you've said something about how the world was magical in 17th century, Mexico or during the conquest, but what about today? How are we to understand this today?
well, what a great question, Sebastiano, and many greetings. I loved your interview on Coast to Coast a few weeks ago, really revelatory. You know, it's one of the reasons I continue to be fascinated with the Castaneda story. Castaneda is a fascinating character who, we still don't really know who he was. We don't know where he was born. He managed to accomplish one of the parts of his shamanic initiation that he describes early in the books, and the run of books I think runs to maybe 18 or 20 volumes in terms of the chronicle that he created, of erasing himself from history. So you will not find a clear photograph of Castaneda on the web. It just doesn't exist, which is extraordinary for somebody who was an international best-selling author. So what I find interesting about the Castaneda story, and we've talked a little bit about it, Jeff, vis-a-vis Gloria Anzaldúa, the Borderlands cultural theorist of South Texas, that regardless of how you take the stories that Castaneda tells about his initiation with Don Juan Matus, what the literature, the stories convey is the mestizo mind in modernity, the mesticized mind, and all of us, in a sense, have the Western mesticized mind as a experience of going through public schools, for instance. But in Castaneda's work, what we get, at the very least in terms of a kind of a narrative, is the performance of the mestizo mind opting for the indigenous cosmovision. And he does it in a way that is about encounters with the extraordinary. He's not bemoaning colonialism. He's not trying to, liberate his brown ass. He's in the way of a new way of seeing, a new way of being. So I continue to go to that work for that narrative, because we don't see that much of the mestizo westernized mind embracing the indigenous cosmovision and seeking to transform himself through that process. Aside from the kind of the voguishness, perhaps, of a romance with the indigenous world, there's this deeper current that's certainly present in Chicanx culture, in Latinx culture, of exploring our lost connection to our indigenous sources. Jose Marti, the great Cuban patriot, he had this phrase. He said, the conquistadores stole a page from the universe. They stole a page from the universe. So there's an archive of the stolen pages that we can only intuit, we can reach towards. It's a very elusive goal, and one that's often dismissed as inauthentic or romantic. We can study ancient Greece, we can study ancient Rome or ancient Egypt, but if you start looking for your connection to indigenous Nahua culture in Mesoamerica, oh well, that's just romantic lore. The mestizo mind has had this disconnected circuit in terms of our connection to this other origin story, the origin story that comes out of the indigenous world. And it's a difficult path to follow. A lot of folks have, spent their lives seeking that reconnection. Certainly a lot of Chicana poets and artists have explored these themes. So it's a transformative imaginary that is rooted in the real.
And of course, the whole category of magic comes down to us through the history of monotheism, where it's pretty much a debased term. It's everything true religion is not. And that's a tough history to be a part of. Let me go through the other questions here because we will run out of time here. The next one's from Juan Acevedo.
Yeah.
And it's a question about the category of mestizo. And he essentially wants to know, mixed with respect to the original indigenous culture or the dominant hegemonic culture. In other words, who gets to generate the mix, the mixedness?
Yeah, such a great question, Juan. This is part of the same process that I was just describing in terms of, in the early era of the Chicano movement in the late 60s, early 70s, there was this tremendous sense of a sought reconnection to the indigenous world and a way of casting off that hegemonic mind. And there was a great deal of it that was fanciful and romantic and not very rigorous. In fact, the last 50 years, Jeff, have been the golden age of Mexican archaeology. Extraordinary discoveries, deepening understanding of early texts, even as those texts might have had filters from the Spanish mind, constructing their narratives. Chronicles and archives give us a way, especially because of the assiduous way that the Spaniards went about chronicling their presence in the New World. They give us a way back into that story, something that was very much a part of, my second book, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire, which drew a lot from the Archivo de las Indias in Sevilla, but was also driven by a very strange experience, which was that in the course of early drafts of material for that book, I realized there was another voice that was emerging that was not my inner voice. It was a voice that was familiar. It was a voice that was always with me, a voice that revealed itself to be a time traveling ancestor from the future. So someone who claimed to be able to traverse time.
John, by a voice, you're not speaking metaphors. You're speaking about hearing a voice.
Hearing a voice, and a voice that I could impart, and takes up half of the book, who claimed to be able to traverse time using the radio wavelengths of the genome. The genome radiates a kind of radio signal. So his name, as he announced himself, was Cenote Siete, Jungle Spring 7. And he lives in a time, in a future in which the World Wide Web has become somehow intuitive. It's become internalized, and instantaneity, infinite searchability, and ubiquity are part of the world that he lives in.
John, not to interrupt. This is too good. This is too good. Did you introduce me to Greg Bear?
Yeah, we did. We talked about
this is
Darwin's Radio.
Darwin's Radio. I mean, that's essentially the idea of the novel, right? That the DNA molecule is a kind of transmitter, as it were.
Time coded. Yeah. So to Juan's question, the mestizo mind is in contact with the past, is remembering the future, and that eschaton of becoming, that's part of the mestizo legacy, is fully contemporary. It's in the now, and as you said, beautiful. I meant to bring it up here with me today, but a beautiful passage in your chapter on Jacques Vallée in Authors of the Impossible, where you talk about, in the now, this stuff is in the newspapers. It's it's on the front page of the New York Times, right. And we're learning that DNA, there isn't junk DNA, and that's one of the things in the Greg Bear narrative is what was thought of as junk DNA turns out to be not junk at all, and is driving a transformation of humanity. So listen, there's so many, P. McDonald and Tom Belote and
Daniel Elizondo. There's so many good questions. Let me get one more in, and then we see how many we get. So Ross Coulthard too. He wants to know what convinced you that supernatural phenomena happen, and he wants to know if you think they're connected to the UAP thing. And if I could connect Tom Belot's question to that, he wants to talk about how a lot of the sci-fi narratives are essentially colonizing narratives. They're about, the alien other conquering the culture. And he wants to know if this is just a projection of our history, or are there other stories, better stories that could be told here? So maybe if you could kind of wrap those all together somehow.
I mean, I don't think there's ever been, for me, well, maybe close second, Arrival by Denis Villeneuve. But Close Encounters of the Third Kind is the preeminent liberatory telling of this story. And
but it lost out. I mean, to the Star Wars, to shoot them up, shoot them up, and just project the Western into outer space.
Indeed.
God forbid it's about precognition and contact.
But the connection to the supernatural, the connect, and what I love the way you and Whitley use that term, the supernatural. These are things that are happening within nature, within history. I've had 3 UFO sightings, 3 UAP sightings. One very much a daylight affair, a spinning metal sphere over the Hollywood Hills, strangely quotidian. In fact, I saw this thing while I was on the phone with an old girlfriend, and then we were staying at a house of a friend, and somewhere we'd arrived the night before. I'd seen a telescope, and I went in to try to find this telescope, but ended up just taking a nap, and so, but very much kind of a spinning sphere, a spinning metallic sphere. Another scene from my terrace over Central Park West in New York City, up towards the Bronx in the afternoon. This one more mysterious, a kind of undulating silver cord, almost like a silver serpent over the Bronx. So much more mysterious, inexplicable, unnerving. And then the third one, actually, and the span of these experiences sort of captures something that I wanted to note in terms of Ross's question. At Chaco Canyon, when I was making this documentary on the harmonic convergence in Chaco Canyon, I was with a very, hardcore cameraman I worked with a lot, very tough guy, no nonsense character. The park rangers had let us camp out on the prairie, on the desert prairie. And so we were out in the middle of this open prairie, and we had a sound person with us. She was also brilliant, also no nonsense. And we were getting sort of dinner together, it's twilight. And then we see this gigantic, luminous ivory dome rising over the desert. And we're, all 3 of us are just stunned and paralyzed, watching this thing kind of begin to move over the desert before we realized it was the moon rising. And so we were in a state of mind, to see the extraordinary quality of that moment. So from a nuts and bolts hardware daylight sighting to this mysterious undulating serpent over the Bronx, to this consensual consciousness rupture, seeing what other people would think of as ordinary, a moonrise was transporting. It kind of illustrates the complexity of these experiences. I love the work that Mike Cleland does in his podcasts and books. The kind of the forensics that Cleland uses to discern encounters with owls and other kinds of natural things taking place in the natural world with the UAP phenomenon and contact experience. I don't think anybody does that better in terms of trying to really suss out what's the nature of what is taking place.
Let's
I love Russ Coulthard's.
let's go to some other questions. Lupe Flores, I'm wary of thinking about mestizaje through the genetic research coming out of genomic technoscience and mestizo genomics in particular. If we consider how mestizaje as a socio-cultural construct has been central to the erasure of indigenous identity and Blackness across Latin and North America, first in the early 20th century and now in the genomic era, how can we reconcile this reality with, with the potentialities of thinking about and with a Republica Cosmica?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lupe's point is really well taken. It's something that comes up a lot in our discussions about mestizaje. We have to recognize that the mestizaje was part of a construction of Spanish race science. Vasconcelos's work, in a very important way, sought to counter that, and I talked about some of the fraught aspects of his work. But there is a radical praxis of mestiza hermeneutics, we have this archive in our blood. There's an archive in the genome itself. Fascinating that it is time coded. That depending on where certain markers are on the genome, identifies where that ancestor is in time. But it's an exhaustive record of our ancestry. It's a jarring idea that this archive, this chronicle of our ancestry, is written in this chemical medium. So it was always with us, but we are the first generation to read it. So you wouldn't expect that out of the gate we're going to fathom the mystery of this story. But you look at the maps of our ancestral migrations, and you see that migration and mestizaje have been the drivers of human becoming. Yeah. And we've always thought about mestizaje as derogatory.
Yeah.
And in the kind of blood quantum of Spanish race science, once you were made impure with non-Spanish blood, it would take 3 successive generations to blanch it out.
Yeah. John, I'm watching the clock. We've only got a few minutes, but just something that very much supports your narrative from the UFO lore is the first, of course, American abduction was Betty and Barney Hill. And of course, Betty was white and Barney was an African American. And amazing. They were very much involved in the civil rights movement. And there was mixed marriages at that time, of course, in US history were extremely volatile and extremely controversial, but that becomes the kind of original point of the at least the American abduction material. I know there were earlier cases.
There's a UAP sighting the day before Columbus arrives on the island of Hispaniola, or what would become the island. So it's important to understand what I'm talking about in terms of this connection between genetic science, and I did a TED talk that really is about this. So if Lupe is interested,
maybe we could put that in the chat, folks.
There's a radical praxis of mestizo hermeneutics that we are just beginning to limn in the most rudimentary ways. The genome was only constructed or mapped out within the last 20 years, and genetics and the DNA molecule around the same time as the Roswell crash, 1947. So we are in the early days of the rumbling of the beginning of all of this, and so the story is going to get, I think, much stranger, much more powerfully revelatory.
If I could add to that, I mean, I used to study gender and sexuality, and one of the things you learn when you study the anthropology of gender and sexuality and religion is that virtually all traditional understandings of gender and sexuality are agricultural. And they see the seed as male and the soil as female, but that implies that the essence of the human is male. And the soil is a necessary container, but not the essence. And the question I always want to ask students is, well, what happens after the human genome? We know that's nonsense. We know it's genetically even. We know that. So what happens to all of our traditional religious ideas about gender and sexuality and inheritance and everything else that flows in its wake? So I think that's just another example of your insight that we're only at the beginning of this
and
spiritual
we are in essence transitional. We are we are in essence that which will be transmuted, and how that manifests itself in history, I think, is at the very center of the mystery of what y'all have gotten at with this archive, which is itself just beginning. So I can only imagine where the archive goes in the future, and what can come into those shelves.
That's why, again, we're going to close down now. It's a perfect segue, John. That's why we're calling it opening the archives. We're not shutting the archives to the impossible. We're opening them. And you got us started here. You opened the opening.
Hey, so this has been such a delight, such an honor.
So John, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we will say goodbye right now.
Well, I'm looking forward to being there in March.
Please
hear all the testimonios that are coming.
Yeah, John will be here with us in person. Please register. You can register online or in person. Please designate that when you register, and please be in touch, and let's do this thing. Let's open the archives that are in us and are us.
Indeed. Many thanks to everyone who joined us today, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for your questions.